phone away. Keep your hands where I can see them.
Do anything. Let me go. You're hurting
Back
me.
against the glass, right now.
Unit 27, we need an additional at 5th and K. Possible resistance.
Please, I wasn't.
The officer's voice cut through the morning air, sharp and practiced. Like a line he had delivered so many times, it no longer required thought. Step back from the entrance. Lower your voice. You're causing a disturbance. It was 842A. M. Outside a federal office building in downtown Washington. D. C. The kind of weekday morning where everything moved with quiet efficiency. The sidewalk still held the faint smell of rain and warm concrete. Cars hissed past on wet pavement. And the distant wail of sirens echoed somewhere beyond the blocks of glass and stone. People in business suits slowed their steps just enough to notice, pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. The woman standing in front of the officer did not raise her hands. She did not step back. She did not argue. She stood beside a stone planter, not blocking the entrance, not gesturing wildly. Her briefcase resting neatly at her feet. She looked at him calmly, her expression steady, and asked a question that landed heavier than any insult ever could. Officer, what exactly am I doing that qualifies as disorderly conduct? For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The officer shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his radio as if waiting for it to tell him what to do next. Ma'am, you are refusing to comply with a lawful order, he said, his voice tightening slightly. The woman glanced around her, taking in the open doorway behind her, the unobstructed path, the steady flow of people passing without delay. I asked you to clarify the order, she replied evenly. That's not refusal. That's a question. A few feet away, someone lifted a phone. A small red recording light flickered on. The officer noticed. His jaw tightened. Authority, when questioned calmly and in public, often feels more threatened than when it is shouted at. You're being disruptive, he said, louder. Now, people are trying to get to work. The woman turned slightly, her voice still level as she addressed the small crowd forming behind them. If anyone here believes I am preventing you from entering the building, please say so. No one spoke. The silence hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. That was the moment everything could have de-escalated. A simple clarification, a brief check, a quiet apology. Instead, something hardened. The officer's posture straightened, his tone sharpened, and the decision was made not by threat or chaos, but by discomfort. Ma'am, turn around, he said. Place your hands behind your back. The city noise dulled as if someone had turned down the volume. You are under arrest for disorderly conduct. For a split second, the words seemed unreal, as if they belonged to a different scene entirely. Disorderly conduct. The charge hung in the air, heavier than the morning humidity, heavier than the quiet that followed it. The woman did not protest. She did not raise her voice or pull away. Instead, she took a slow breath, the kind taken by someone who already understands the weight of what is happening. She bent slightly, lifted her briefcase with care, and placed it on the ground beside the planter, as though order itself mattered more now than ever. Then she turned around. Cold metal closed around her wrists with a dull click that echoed far louder than it should have. A few people in the crowd flinched at the sound. Someone whispered something indistinct. Another phone was raised, its camera steady, unblinking. The officer guided her toward the patrol car, his hand firm on her arm, his voice low and controlled, repeating instructions that no longer required explanation. The woman walked without resistance, her posture straight, her steps measured. as if she were moving through a place she had studied before. As she was placed beside the cruiser, she lifted her eyes briefly and met the gaze of the person recording. There was no panic there. No confusion. No plea for understanding. Only focus. Inside her mind, details were already arranging themselves with quiet precision. The exact wording of the command, the lack of obstruction, the absence of any raised voice. She knew what disorderly conduct required, and she knew what it did not. She had argued these distinctions in courtrooms where consequences were decided by inches and commas. A second officer arrived, scanning the scene quickly, taking in the federal building. The cuffs, the small but growing cluster of onlookers. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The first officer's decision had already set the tone. Behind them, traffic continued to flow, and the normal rhythm of the morning tried to reassert itself, even as something deeply unbalanced settled into place. As the patrol car door opened, one of the officers muttered under his breath, barely audible above the city noise, "Who did we just arrest?" No one answered. The door closed with a solid thud, sealing the moment inside the vehicle. The woman sat quietly in the back seat, eyes forward, hands cuffed. Not because she had lost control, but because she had chosen not to fight a decision that would soon have to answer for itself. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, tires whispering over the wet pavement as downtown Washington resumed its routine around them. From the back seat, the city looked slightly distorted through the tinted glass, buildings sliding past like silent witnesses. The woman sat upright, her hands resting in her lap, the cuffs cool against her skin. The radio crackled with routine chatter. License plates, status checks, voices detached and procedural. No one mentioned the phones. No one mentioned the federal building. No one mentioned that a simple verification could have ended everything before it began. She stared straight ahead, not out of defiance, but out of habit. In her mind, the encounter replayed with quiet precision. The initial command, the request for clarification, the absence of any actual disturbance. She noted the time again, anchoring it carefully. These details mattered. Not emotionally, but legally. This was how moments like this were dismantled later, piece by piece, without raising one's voice. In the front seat, the officer driving kept his eyes on the road. The arresting officer adjusted his radio and told himself he had followed procedure, that she could sort it out later, that if she were important, someone would make a call, that this was not personal. It never felt personal to the one holding the cuffs. It felt administrative, necessary, justified by momentum. But in the back seat sat someone who had spent years teaching others how that momentum worked, how officers often escalated not because of danger, but because control had been questioned too calmly and too publicly, how vague charges turned discomfort into authority, how paperwork later tried to make instinct look like reason. She thought about the irony without smiling. She had litigated cases just like this. She had warned departments that one day they would do it to the wrong person. Not wrong because she mattered more than anyone else. Wrong because the evidence would be clean, undeniable, recorded from multiple angles. As the cruiser merged into traffic, the sidewalk where it all began faded from view. The people who had stood there went on with their mornings, but the imbalance created in that moment did not disappear. It traveled with her, logged in dispatch systems, captured on phones, waiting for the point where names, titles, and assumptions would collide. The story did not begin in the back of that patrol car. It began years earlier, in places no one on that morning commute could see. Her name was Angela Brooks, and long before handcuffs closed around her wrists. She had learned how easily power could mislabel calm as defiance. She grew up in Prince George's County, the daughter of a postal worker and a public school librarian, in a home where rules mattered and fairness was discussed at the dinner table as something fragile, something that required attention to survive. Angela learned early that composure was not weakness. It was armor. In classrooms, where she was often the only black student, she learned to speak precisely, to choose her words carefully, to never give anyone an excuse to dismiss her arguments as emotion. If she was going to be challenged, she would make it impossible to ignore the facts. That discipline followed her through college and into law school, where expectations were high and mistakes were remembered longer when they came from someone who looked like her. She studied late under buzzing fluorescent lights. Case law spread out across library tables, learning not just what the law said, but how it was bent, how it was avoided, and how it was enforced differently depending on who stood in front of authority. She graduated near the top of her class, with offers from private firms that promised money, comfort, and distance from conflict. She turned them down without hesitation. Angela chose the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, a place where victories were slow and pressure came quietly. It was work that required patience, precision, and the ability to stay steady while systems resisted change. She was not drawn to attention or headlines. Her power would come from preparation, from knowing the rules so well that when they were broken, there would be no way to deny it. At the Department of Justice, Angela Brooks learned how slowly accountability moves when it is forced to travel through institutions designed to resist it. She worked housing discrimination cases that stretched across years, files growing thicker while families waited for relief. She handled police misconduct lawsuits that required watching body camera footage frame by frame, learning to read not just what officers said, but what they avoided saying. She took on voting rights cases where a single paragraph in a brief could decide whether thousands of ballots would be counted or quietly discarded. By the time she became a senior litigator, Angela had argued in federal courtrooms across the country. She had deposed police chiefs who spoke in polished phrases while avoiding direct answers. She had cross-examined officers who insisted they feared for their lives as video played behind them showing a different reality entirely. Her name appeared in internal DOJ emails alongside words like meticulous, thorough, unflinching. She was not flashy. She did not grandstand. Her strength came from preparation and patience. She knew disorderly conduct statutes by heart. She understood how their vagueness made them useful, how they could be stretched to fit almost any situation where authority felt challenged. She had helped draft training materials explaining how these charges were often misused to punish people who asserted their rights too clearly, too calmly. She had warned departments repeatedly that calm resistance was not a crime, that asking questions did not justify escalation, that embarrassment was not a legal standard. She had spent years telling younger attorneys how to recognize retaliatory arrests when they saw them, how to dismantle them carefully using timelines, language, and video. And now, sitting in the back of a patrol car under the very charge she had spent a career confronting, Angela understood the moment with unsettling clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern she knew intimately. The officer who arrested her had his own story, one that looked ordinary on paper and dangerous only in hindsight. Officer Ryan Keller had been on the force for 7 years, long enough to feel confident in his instincts, not long enough to have those instincts seriously challenged. He grew up in a quiet suburb where police authority was rarely questioned and compliance was assumed to be the natural order of things. By the time he entered the academy, procedure came easily to him. De-escalation sounded good in lectures. But on the street, it felt abstract. Keller relied on command presence, a firm voice, clear orders, control established early. It worked most of the time. And when it didn't, the system rarely pushed back. His personnel file was clean. No sustained complaints. A few citizen reports marked unfounded. Supervisors described him as proactive, assertive, sometimes rigid. The kind of notes that sat quietly in personnel files, never rising high enough to trigger intervention. Over time, Keller absorbed an unspoken lesson that patrol work reinforced daily. Backing down in public looked like weakness. Explaining yourself invited debate. And debate, especially when calm and confident, felt like a challenge to authority. That morning outside the federal building, he saw a woman who did not move when told, who asked questions instead of complying, who did so without fear or agitation. His mind filled in gaps before facts arrived. He did not see a threat, but he felt his control slipping. And when control felt uncertain, he reached for the tool that ended conversations quickly. Disorderly conduct, a charge broad enough to restore authority, to shift the narrative from officer behavior to civilian behavior. As he placed the cuffs on Angela's wrists, Keller told himself he was following procedure, that she could sort it out later, that this was not personal. What he did not know was that the woman he had just arrested had spent years teaching others exactly how moments like this went wrong. By the time the patrol car returned to the federal complex, the morning had grown busier. Foot traffic thickened near the security checkpoint, lines forming as employees waited to badge in, coffee cups cooling in their hands. When Angela Brooks was guided out of the back seat, her wrists cuffed in front of her now. Heads turned openly. She walked without resistance. Her posture straight, her expression controlled. The way she had learned to carry herself in spaces where composure was constantly tested. Officer Keller stayed close at her side. His voice low but firm, as he repeated instructions meant less for her than for the audience watching. Stay right here. Don't move. Angela nodded once. She understood the performance. She had seen it before from the other side of courtroom transcripts. Around them, phones were raised higher now, their cameras steady, capturing angles Keller could no longer control. "Officer," Angela said calmly, "I am a federal employee. I have identification in my bag. I am asking you to verify before this goes any further." Keller did not look at the bag. "We'll deal with that at the station." He replied, "You chose to escalate this." The word hung in the air. Misplaced and unchallenged, Angela turned slightly toward the small crowd. "I am being arrested for disorderly conduct," she said clearly. "I have not blocked entry. I have not raised my voice. If you are recording, please keep recording." The crowd shifted. A security guard near the entrance frowned and touched his earpiece but said nothing. Protocol, once invoked, became a cage that trapped everyone inside it. A man in line finally spoke. "She hasn't done anything." Keller snapped his head toward him. "Sir, step back. This is an active arrest." The man complied immediately. Hands raised in apology. Silence settled again. As Angela was guided back toward the cruiser, she listed facts aloud. Not for Keller, but for the record. For the record, "Officer, I am not resisting. I am not disorderly. I am complying under protest." These words were not defiance. They were preservation. The patrol car pulled into the precinct lot just before 9 o'clock. The building was unremarkable, concrete and glass worn smooth by routine. Inside, The air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. The kind of place where time flattened and urgency disappeared. Angela was guided through a side entrance away from the public lobby. Her cuffs still on. The sound of her footsteps echoing faintly down the hallway. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the same pale tone. At the booking desk, Officer Keller recited the charge without hesitation. Disorderly conduct. The words sounded practiced, almost automatic, as if repetition alone could make them true. The desk sergeant glanced up briefly, his eyes moving from the cuffs to Angela's face. He paused for half a second, then returned to the screen in front of him and began typing. No one asked what disruption had occurred. No one asked who had complained. The paperwork moved forward, steady and unquestioned. Angela stood still, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slow. When asked to remove her watch and jewelry, she did so carefully, placing each item exactly where instructed. The cuffs remained indoors. Their sound was sharper, more final, every small movement producing a faint clink that cut through the room. She spoke once more, her voice calm and precise. "Sergeant, I am requesting that my federal identification be reviewed before processing continues." The sergeant looked at Keller. Keller shook his head slightly. "We'll verify later," he said. She was disruptive on scene. The label closed the conversation. No one challenged it. Angela was guided to a holding bench and told to sit. The surface was cold through the fabric of her slacks. Across the room, a woman sat hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red. A man paced in tight circles, muttering under his breath. Angela kept her gaze forward. She had taught others about this moment, the point where dignity was tested not by force, but by procedure. Here, injustice didn't need to raise its voice. It only needed to be processed. Time slowed inside the holding area. Minutes stretched, marked only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the scrape of a chair leg somewhere down the hall. Angela sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, eyes forward, noting details the way she always had. The names on badges as officers passed. The exact phrasing used when her request for verification was denied. The time displayed on the small digital clock above the booking desk when the cuffs were finally removed for fingerprinting. None of this was emotional. It was methodical. In another room, Officer Keller finished his report. He chose his words carefully, building one sentence on top of the next. Subject refused to comply. Subject caused alarm. Subject continued behavior after instruction. Each line reinforced the last, shaping a version of events that justified the charge neatly. He did not write about the calm tone. He did not write about the unobstructed entrance. He did not write about the phones held steady just a few feet away. The shift changed quietly, without announcement. A door near the booking area opened, and a woman in a dark blazer stepped inside, her presence altering the room before she spoke. Captain Elaine Morris, Watch Commander. 23 years on the job. She had learned long ago that reports often arrive too late, and that the truth usually revealed itself in posture and silence. Her eyes moved first to Angela, then to the charge screen glowing on the monitor. Disorderly conduct. Location, Federal Complex. Timestamp. Morris felt the weight of it immediately. She turned to the desk sergeant. "Who is she?" The sergeant hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Keller answered from behind him. Subject was non-compliant and caused a disturbance outside the federal building. Morris looked back at Angela. The stillness, the lack of agitation, the absence of chaos. None of it matched the words on the screen. "Ma'am," Morris said evenly, State your name for the record. Angela did not hesitate. Angela Brooks, Senior Litigator, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. The room went quiet. Not with tension, but with focus. Morris's hands rested on the edge of the desk. She didn't look at Keller yet. She didn't need to. Captain Morris did not react outwardly to the name. Years on the job had taught her that restraint mattered most when rooms were watching. Instead, she nodded once and turned to the desk sergeant. "Bring me her identification. Now." The word carried weight without volume. A moment later, Angela's bag was retrieved and placed on the counter. The zipper opened slowly, deliberately. Inside were neatly arranged documents, including a federal identification card bearing the seal Morris recognized instantly. Morris examined it carefully, comparing the photo to Angela's face, then picked up the phone. The call was short, efficient. When it ended, the confirmation was immediate and unmistakable. Angela Brooks, Senior Counsel, active status, Civil Rights Division. Morris closed her eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of what this meant. When she opened them, the temperature in the room had changed. She turned toward Keller for the first time. Why was this not verified on scene? Keller's mouth opened, then closed. She refused to comply. He said finally. Morris's voice remained level. Refused to comply with what? Officer. The question hung unanswered. Morris stepped closer to Angela. "Miss Brooks, you should not have been arrested. This should have been resolved outside that building. I am authorizing your immediate release." Angela nodded once, her expression unchanged. "I would like a copy of the incident report," she said calmly. "All body camera footage, and the names of everyone involved." Morris met her gaze. "You will have them." Around them, officers avoided eye contact. The truth had arrived quietly, and it did not need to raise its voice. Morris turned back to Keller. "You are relieved from duty pending review. Turn in your weapon and your badge." Keller's face drained of color. "Captain, I was following procedure." Morris shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You followed momentum." The sound of the cuffs coming off was almost too soft to notice. A small metallic release that marked the end of one moment and the beginning of another. Angela flexed her wrists once, not in pain, but in acknowledgement, then stood as the room slowly returned to motion. Officers resumed tasks without speaking. Eyes lowered, the weight of what had just happened settling unevenly across the precinct. Outside those walls, the story was already moving faster than any internal process could keep up with. By the time Angela stepped out of the building, phones were buzzing with updates. Clips that had circulated without context now carried names. Someone recognized her from a DOJ panel. Someone else confirmed her title. The words "senior litigator" appeared in captions. Then, headlines. What had started as a routine arrest was now being replayed frame by frame by people far beyond that sidewalk. The department issued a statement within hours. "An internal review is underway. We take this matter seriously." The language was careful, familiar, already behind the moment. Internal Affairs opened its investigation with an urgency that felt new. Body camera footage was reviewed alongside witness videos and dispatch audio. The timeline didn't bend. There was no crowd interference, no raised voice, no obstruction. The justification for disorderly conduct collapsed under its own weight. Then the review widened. Keller's previous reports were pulled. Not just complaints, but patterns of language, repeated reliance on broad charges when challenged. Notes from supervisors resurfaced. Words like assertive and needs improvement with de-escalation. Observations that had never triggered action on their own. Now, placed in sequence, they told a different story. Within weeks, Keller was terminated. The letter cited improper arrest, failure to follow protocol, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His appeal never made it past the first review. The evidence was too clean, the context too public, momentum, the same force that had carried the arrest forward, had turned against him just as decisively. The lawsuit was filed before the week ended. It arrived on the city's legal docket without drama. Athens. Methodical documents stripped of emotion and heavy with detail. Dates, times, names. Direct quotations pulled from body camera transcripts and witness videos. Angela Brooks did not need to dramatize what had happened to her. The facts did that on their own. The complaint named Officer Ryan Keller individually. It named the department. It named the city. Unlawful arrest. Retaliatory enforcement. Violation of Fourth Amendment protections. Failure to supervise. Each claim tied cleanly to a moment that had already been recorded and replayed countless times. The city moved quickly after that. Settlement discussions began before depositions were complete. When the agreement was announced, the number landed hard. $750,000. No admission of wrongdoing. The city insisted, but the consent decree attached told a different story. Mandatory verification protocols. Revised disorderly conduct guidelines. Body camera review triggers for arrests near government buildings. Training updates. Oversight. Changes that should have existed long before a calm woman asked a simple question on a sidewalk. Angela accepted the settlement quietly. She did not celebrate it. She redirected much of it into civil rights training, legal aid funding, and know your rights programs she had once recommended in meetings that went nowhere. For the department, the fallout lingered. Command staff reshuffled. Policy memos circulated. Officers were reminded that calm resistance was not a crime. Some listened. Some resented it. The following Monday, Angela returned to work. Same building. Same entrance. This time, security nodded her through without hesitation. No raised voices. No commands. No sirens. Just the quiet weight of what had changed and what had not. Justice had moved. Not cleanly and not quickly, but unmistakably. This was never a story about a cop arresting the wrong person. It was a story about a system that relies on momentum, silence, and vague charges to survive. This time, the person in handcuffs knew the law well enough to make sure it didn't. And that made all the difference.